podcast, and Michael just asked me the question, when did you do something for the first time, the last time? So this is today something new. We are live streaming, and we have a guest from San Francisco, Jennifer Brook from Dropbox. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me into this totally fun experiment.
New thing. So we record a podcast, but we're live streaming on YouTube. And for the guys on YouTube who don't know what this is, we're doing this podcast for the last year.
Since May 1st, Labor Day.
Labor
Germany,
Day,
last
exactly.
year.
It's about new work. So this means technology that is changing, digital transformation, but also like why do we work? What is the purpose and that stuff? And that's why you're here. You're combining both worlds, and we want to talk about that. And just to give a little bit of where we're sitting, that's the Blackboard office here. And we, for the first time, built this live streaming setup, which is quite big. So we try to ignore the cameras and dive into the podcast. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm sure you're curious about my work and what I do, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. So I'm a design researcher. I work at Dropbox. People would probably be curious to know that there's 20 of us working within the organization, and we work within and in partnership with our with people in product and engineering and design, product designers, and we work all across the organization. So we're really focused on answering questions that are core to our business, but we're also advocates for the people that use our products. And so that's kind of our primary curiosity, is to really understand more about them and how we can build products and services that can support their goals and their life and their work.
What did you lead into this job? What was your, where were you born? Where did you go to school? Tell us a bit about you.
That could take forever.
Ah, that's
so
nice. We're a podcast. We're not a
always
TV
say
interview.
2-3 sentences, and Michael then says,
No,
no, make
20
it
to
20,
30.
30.
20, okay,
Yeah.
2030. All right, so I'll get it started, and then you can ask
Absolutely.
me where we want to go from here. So I don't think where I was born was that interesting, but I'll say that it was the United States. I grew up in Florida, which is a totally strange place to grow up, and every German that I've met has been there, which is
I was there, yeah.
I've never been there.
you're the first German
Okay.
I've met who hasn't been there. It's a wonderful place to holiday, so many people go. And in university, I studied cognitive psychology, so I was actually working under leisure psychologists and visual art. And
Wow, nice combination.
yeah, for me, it was great. And at university, this was a very long time ago at this point, the researchers that I was working under were studying leisure, what are the conditions that need to be in place for people to kind of feel a sense of flow. So they were working after the famous researcher, I'm not going to get his name right, but Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who studies those ideas.
Flo, the author of the book, Flo.
Exactly, yes.
Nice.
And the ironic thing about them is that they were the most overworked, tired people I've ever met.
Okay.
And so that was sort of like a clue for me that just because you study something or do something doesn't mean that you are actually capable of doing it for yourself. Or there's this other idea that I became familiar with, which is the idea of you teach what you most need to learn. So that you're doing this podcast is kind of curious to me, that you're kind of in the thick of it and exploring these ideas. I would love to also hear more from you two about. So anyway, I decided that research path wasn't for me, because I saw how I didn't want my life to be that way. I wanted to live a more vibrant life and one filled with more creativity, and so I took a different path. And I spent most of my 20s living kind of an unconventional life. I built part of a treehouse and lived in a treehouse for
Wow.
many years.
Where was this?
This was in North Carolina. And my very first job out of college was running a creative arts studio at a rural, what we call like a healing farm. So people with severe mental illnesses are coming there to really get treatment and do it in a way that's focused and about their care. And after that, I went and lived in this treehouse for many years. And it was while I was living there that I started to discover design. But I wasn't interested in design. At the time, I was making handmade books. I was totally obsessed with the technology of the book and what was happening in Europe in the 15th and 16th and 17th century which was this kind of technological maelstrom where you had the printing press, but then you also had this really interesting technology that was emerging called papermaking. And papermaking is sort of the underdog of the story. But I actually think it's the hero and gets kind of under-talked about. But in learning about these different technological moments, I was also becoming obsessed with the lives of the journeymen and the printers and the papermakers and all the people that were living in Europe kind of inside of this technological change that was also having huge implications for culture.
Wow.
And at this time, I'm living, if you can imagine, in the middle of nowhere, like in the woods, in a treehouse, totally obsessed with making books the old-fashioned way, you know, where at one point that was high tech, you know, it isn't that way anymore. And I was also reading Fast Company and starting to kind of the idea that the things that I was reading about that had happened in the past were still happening with us in the present, and that I could actually participate in that conversation and situate myself inside of that conversation. So all those ideas kind of came together in my mind, and it was probably a 1 to 2 year transition where I decided to transition into working in information architecture and interaction design, and ended up getting a job at the New York Times. So
Wow.
that was about 10 years ago.
And then from New York Times, you then moved some time to the Valley or to San Francisco, or was there something
Yeah,
in between?
exactly. So I came into the field as a designer, but with this kind of creative arts and research background, and became familiar with research as a practice. And once I had the experience of having seen how people use the products that I'm designing or expected to design, or had in-depth conversations with them about their life and their context, I never wanted to design any other way. Like, it just didn't make any sense that if we're building these products for people and for networks, that those are the things that we need to understand at a very deep level in order to do that in a responsible way. And so over the period of 10 years, I sort of slowly transitioned my work from doing design all the time to being a hybrid designer, researcher, practitioner, to now full-time research. And so I moved from New York to San Francisco almost 2 years ago to join Dropbox.
Maybe before we deep dive into the work you're doing there, you can tell us a little bit about Dropbox. We all use Dropbox, but the company behind, at least for me, is a black box. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about
like their culture, or
Yeah.
So the organization, I think, is between 1,500 and 2,000. We have a number of global offices. Our headquarters is in San Francisco, and it's a delightful place. It's very sweet. We have probably one of the more fun, playful, curious things that people hear about and want to know more about is we have 5 company values, and one of them is something we call cupcake. And cupcake, yeah.
That's cool.
So yeah, just
Yeah,
that
yeah.
like
Mhm.
you can kind of get it just saying it out loud. It's we don't even write it out. It's an image of a cupcake,
Okay.
and it's it's delightful. It's different depending on who you
Surprising.
ask. Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What are the other values? Are there pictures as well, or are you describing them in words?
I'll share a few more with you. So our number one value is be worthy of trust. It's something we're committed to as an organization, as a product, as a service. And to me, in my work, this really does connect back to the people that we're building products for and serving, and really deeply understanding what that means to them.
So, what I would be interested in, we're in the technology cloud field, so I'm quite aware of that. And what I love is that you mentioned trust, because in one of the last discussions I had with a client, they said, yeah, we are driven by our digital transformation and want to change that. And we talked about technology, and I said, at the core, all there is trust that you sell. It's like with a bank. You go there and you trust the company. How do you make sure, culture-wise, design-wise, that people understand that and live that? Because that's something we face when we meet people and think of like, okay, new work and more trust and more autonomy. Like, I mean, what the guys built today was completely on their own, and I trusted them that it works.
So by the way, guys, we do a live podcast today. It was their idea.
So yeah, like how do you get that transported by design?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think design plays a really big role in communicating trust. When I worked for the New York Times, the number one reason why the Times existed was because people trusted them. And everything that you, every decision that you make, it has to have that in consideration. And you can't do anything to erode that trust. And I think design is actually the interface for communicating those values. The other thing about trust that I think is really interesting is exactly what you're talking about, which is how important trust is to creating a culture of collaboration and safe spaces and safety at work. And so working to facilitate that mutual trust between collaborators is a really interesting part of that as well.
What was your impression? You arrived here and you like took a walk through the office, and usually people come, we meet, and then they leave. And you were like, oh no, I'm walking around.
Can I walk a little bit around?
Can I walk a little bit? It felt good. So, do you do that quite often?
Randomly walk through offices that I just arrive in. It's probably my researcher behavior coming through. So I also have a sort of personal curiosity about the way that the architecture of spaces manifest and reflect company culture. And so I feel like a lot of that becomes legible just in being in a space and not just seeing, but like sensing or feeling what's here. And I think the things that are interesting or distinctive about the space is you have this transparency throughout, but there's also, when you're standing on the other side of it, it's the way the glass is, it isn't actually super distracting. Like there's an interesting obscuring that can happen. So it's not like, a straight shot through. But yeah, so I think that kind of makes me curious, like, oh, that's a choice that you made, and I'm curious about that. And it was probably intentional or if not unconsciously reflecting something that matters to you.
Oh,
so
I like that. Yeah.
I don't know, you can do you want to comment on that? Or?
No, I think the attitude to come to a place and to really want to know before where are you. That's what I really could feel from the very first moment, and I really like this. As we told you before, we are on the way to new work. So we try to discover together with our guests and our team, our wonderful team, how work will change. We believe it changed over the last 10 years, probably more than the 20 to 30 years before, and we believe in the next 10 to 20 years it will change even more. And it's a topic where you're working as well on. So you believe in teams, you believe in collaboration, you did research on this. Maybe you can give us some insights. What do you believe will change in the future?
Sure, and maybe that'll be a question we get around to that
Absolutely.
I won't answer right away.
Yeah, sure.
The first thing that I do want to say about that is I don't think anything is inevitable. So I think I have power, personal power, and I think that we all have power to shape a conversation and shape the direction of all of these things. So that's something that I personally celebrate and am excited about. I think sometimes when we talk about the future of work or use that specific language, there's sort of an inevitability implied, and I don't believe in that. And so backing up a little bit, Dropbox as an organization is committed to building products that facilitate teamwork. We really believe that it's small, coordinated groups of people that are making the world run. And we think it's those teams that are connecting and coordinating with other teams that build epic, incredible things. And so in terms of the kinds of products that we're working on and the things that we want to build in the future, that's for us a huge space of opportunity and innovation, and one we believe isn't really being done well or right now. And so the work that I'm doing is, if that's our sort of thesis, then as an organization we should become absolutely obsessed with what that looks like at its best, and really go out in the world and search for examples where we're seeing people working in these small teams in ways that are positive and mutually beneficial for everyone involved. And so that was one of the first projects that I worked on when I joined Dropbox, was a project to really understand what was happening in what we call superpowered teams.
Superpower teams.
And we, to kind of get to this, or get to the deeper story, myself and two other researchers, so Jimena Ampuero and Eduardo Ramirez, we kind of set off. And we started out by doing really quick phone conversations with about 40 different individuals. And we identified 8 of them that we felt their story and what they were describing was really compelling. And from there, we went and did observational research. So we just asked if we could watch and observe them work together and interact in whatever thing they had to do that day together. And
For how long did you do this? For more?
several hours, in one case an entire day, and then we would follow up either that day or later on in the week with a kind of debrief interview to talk about what we observed and what we were seeing, and just to ask questions about their work and many other things. So, and the kinds of teams, everyone's like, well, who did you talk to? It was kind of all over the map. So we talked to people doing cancer research. We talked to teams producing Broadway musicals. We talked to a group of educators working at a university. People building voter registration software and working in the marketing department. I mean, it just kind of all over the map. So real range. And we observed a lot of really interesting things. So I don't know that we'll have time to kind of unpack all of it.
We have,
of course,
for sure.
That's what's interesting.
Yeah. So 2 things that I think actually are really foundational. Actually, I'll back up. At a very high level, if you ask me what makes teams successful or what makes them great, it's their relationships. That's the number one thing that really creates a possibility of success in that working relationship. And that's what we saw in all of these teams, was that they had really strong relationships. There were 2 kind of things, an interplay of 2 things that we also think were interesting. The first is, in all of these teams, we saw the presence of someone that we called the culture maker. And
So it's always one person? More
well, I was going to say it doesn't have to be one person.
Okay.
So in some cases it was, in a lot of ways, everyone on the team was kind of occupying this role to different degrees. In addition to that idea that there are people within the team that are actively working to shape culture in positive ways, the teams themselves, half of them were working together to co-create social contracts with each other. So this was a really fun discovery. We know from social science that norming is something that we just do as humans, but it's often a very implicit thing. Like we pick up social cues, or I may be walking through this space and notice that nobody's dancing, so I'm gonna, refrain from dancing in this space.
Stop dancing.
Yeah.
Okay.
But actually, in actuality, dancing might be a totally appropriate thing that's welcome here.
Everyone was running when we hit the fire alert.
Yeah.
Minutes ago. Okay.
We did
Good
have a
point.
fire alarm directly before. So the cool thing about these teams was that rather than having implicit unconscious relationships with each other, they were having explicit conscious conversations about what they value, how they want to make decisions, how they want to be with each other, how they want to communicate, where they want to communicate, and co-creating their culture together. And I think that's an amazing and powerful idea. And the thing that I take away from it is that I'm not a passive recipient of culture or of collaboration, that it's my responsibility to step up, do culture making, and work with any team that I'm leading or being led to have those conversations. And so, yeah, I think...
So you really could see that teams which behave in this way are stronger, better, they have a better relationship when every team member really tries to give his or her input into the culture of a team. It helps them to then have more fruitful, more innovative
they have a
working
sense of
relations.
ownership over their conditions and the ways that they're working, and totally we saw this.
How's that changing? Sorry.
No.
How's that changing? Thinking of, let's say, roles in the teams are changing. Hierarchies are a lot smoother than in the early days. Younger people step up quite earlier. How is it behaving let's say on a stressful day, what could you see when not everything is running smooth, and like how is the culture then supporting conflict, conflict management or
Yeah,
solution?
so one example of this, which we didn't get to see, because I think people were probably on their best behavior, but we heard, we did hear stories about past experiences that were more challenging or frustrating, so we were able to kind of get that perspective through conversation. One really interesting technique that one of the teams was using to kind of manage conflict was something that they call the red dot conversation.
Red dog?
Red dot, yeah, like
red dot.
like
Red
a
dot,
red polka dot. And I think this is an idea that's coming from Chris McGough's book, The Primes. And it's a tool that they were using so that they could have, and a red dot conversation is a conversation that's outside of an everyday conversation. So it's not about making niceties or just getting the work done. It's, I come to you and say, I think there's something going on here. I would like to have a red dot conversation. And that signals to you that I want to have a very specific kind of conversation.
Focused onto one detail or
one topic,
aspect.
and that might actually have conflict inherent in it, or it might be a sensitive thing for us to talk about. And what that does is it, you can obviously say, I'm not ready for that, or maybe we can have that tomorrow. But it creates an intention and an intentionality around having those conversations so that you're not surprised, and I'm expressing, my desire to have that relationship with you and kind of get to the bottom of whatever it is that we're working through. And then we can kind of step outside of day-to-day conversation and go deeper into whatever the topic is. And so that's actually a really specific example of one of the ways that team chose to norm with each other, and specifically around conflict, which is to say we see conflict as something that's actually great for our development and for our growth, and we want to invite it, but we want to invite it in ways that feel safe and that have boundaries. Another interesting thing that we heard was from one of the researchers. He called his team a kind of band of misfits and said that they're
Band of misfits.
a band of misfits. And we met them. They're definitely misfits. They're kind of from all over the world, occupy a multitude of perspectives, and are all coming together to work on this one problem of eradicating cancer. But the idea that they're misfits was really central to their core identity. And what the misfit idea allowed them to do was it allowed them to disagree, to have a contrarian point of view, to, in service of pushing their mission, which is good science and good research. And so those two methods for kind of relating to possible conflict are very different. And so the other thing to take away from all of this, or that we took away from this, was that it isn't about every team having the same culture. It's actually really like difference and nuance and how boring would it be, if I were here telling you your culture should be this way, right? And who am I to tell you that? It's not it doesn't make sense. And so the thing that I took away was that cultures are going to be different, and that's awesome and should be celebrated. And the thing that really matters is that the team itself has created alignment around what their culture is and what they want it to be, and are really practicing living that and finding space to talk about when they don't live up to their own standards and their own values.
What I love about that is that makes culture like a tool that you can use in a small team, like to organize, and not and like takes it a bit out of this thing that you cannot grasp in a large corporation. When you have someone being responsible for the culture like this, you could say, okay, well, you run a small team, and implicitly culture is the tool that you drive it with.
Totally.
So are there ways to train that to people, that they learn how to emphasize that in a small team, even if they're younger, not that experienced, not have a background?
So as a researcher, you never know exactly how your research is going to be used. One story about this and the way that we brought this back into the organization was after I did a workshop to share these findings with a bunch of people across the organization, because we felt like these are really awesome findings with really interesting implications for our organization, our products, our services. Two of the designers were like, this is so cool. We want to facilitate team contract workshop.
Wow.
And so
Team contract workshop.
they were like,
it's a nice phrase, yeah.
Yeah, it was beautiful. And I think it was last year, we did it with about 70 people, and it was bringing in our cross-functional partners. So it was product managers, designers, writers, and researchers, but the teams that they were working in, those small teams. And the workshop was about 2 or 3 hours, and it was a dedicated space for those teams to start having those conversations. From there, the place that project went next is I ended up working with a researcher, Julie Ann Hawk, and we collaborated. She works for a really cool organization called Build Up, and they put on a conference every year called Build Peace, and it's for people working at the intersection of peacemaking and technology. And she was aware of this research and was like, hey, let's do a really cool thing where you and I collaborate because you're from this tech context and I'm from this peacemaking context. And so we got together and made a toolkit that we called Prototyping Peace, and it was about giving people the tools to facilitate these kinds of micro accords in their groups, whatever their groups are, whether they're community or their team. And so I actually brought one for you too if you want. So this is the second version of it, and we are calling it just the Team Toolkit.
Cool.
And yeah, it's a prototype, it's an experiment, it's
Can I have a look?
yeah, absolutely. It's something that we're kind of exploring and experimenting with ourselves. So we made 100 of these. Half of them went across the organization. So it was kind of, I put a call out and said, hey, if you're interested, raise your hand. And we got people from Sydney and Austin and Dublin and New York to kind of put their hand up and volunteer to test them out.
And I love that. It's like, I just read it out to give context: identifying personal values as number 1, exploring shared values number 2, and then documenting our alliances.
It's so simple.
And it sounds very simple and hands-on, but it makes it actually a tool. I love that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you can in the foundation time of a team, you can really see whether there is someone who does not fit, and he can say, well, I want to go to another team because I can't share their values. So you really can make sure from the very beginning that there's no dysfunctionality in the team.
Yeah, and a story from when Julie and I made the kit, we absolutely felt like testing it on ourselves was the responsible thing to do. And so we had a conversation really early on about when we were doing the individual values exercise. And in it, the idea is there's a deck of animals. So you spread out the animals, and you two share stories. One story about a time when you had a collaboration that felt really positive and where the work was easy, or felt easy even if it wasn't the easiest work that you were doing. And you choose an animal that reflects that experience for you in some way, and then tell your partner a story.
Wow.
And then you do it from the perspective of an experience or collaboration that wasn't so great. And so you're kind of getting these two different angles on a person's values. And in having that conversation with Julie, the thing that I discovered about her was that she values excellence. That's something that she lives for. And for her to be able to do excellent work, she needs to have clarity of responsibility. So she needs to know what it is that's hers to do, and she's going to do that thing extremely well. I am like, thrive on chaos, right? Yeah. I mean, yeah, you see me.
I know what you're talking about.
You see me, yeah.
He's the other.
Yeah. So we, we what's interesting is we got to this moment, and she's like, oh, I'm realizing that one of the questions we should include is, do we anticipate any conflict? And we immediately were like, this will be a point of conflict for us if we don't have this conversation. And so the decision that we made in that moment was I said, listen, I thrive on chaos, but I'm also willing to come one step closer to you and to have a conversation about our respective roles and responsibilities and to work toward clarity. And we didn't have conflict. It was kind of, it worked. The idea worked on us. So
do you have any idea on a broader perspective how many teams work in this cool atmosphere and how many teams don't? Is it a 5% to 95%, or is it even worse?
We don't know yet. I mean, this isn't something that we've gone out to try to size. My intuition is that it's probably not so many, that we looked hard for these teams, and we found them. So they're sort of the diamonds in the rough.
Yeah.
It's my hope and my idea that these kinds of ideas are really powerful, and they're also ideas that I actually feel a responsibility to not keep for ourselves, right? To not kind of keep in the organization, but to share and to generously give to people so that they can experiment as well. So our idea with this kit is that we want to bring it out into the commons and make it available to the public sometime in the next few months.
Very cool. Yeah.
Super cool.
And then it might not work for you, or you might adapt it, or
it will.
So
My team
For
already
sure.
knows that next week they go through a workshop, right? Yeah.
My learning or my experience, I think I'm much older than you guys, is whenever a team comes up with a strong vision, what is developed out of their personal energy. It's not, well, you 5 guys, you have to develop this and this. It's the other way around. We have an idea. So example, I give you 2 examples. We had a team, I think 6 or 7 years ago, which came up with the idea to build up the first top-level domain with a social purpose. By this time, we had the .com, .org, maybe 20, and then there was the chance to buy or to create new ones. Very, very long process, $200,000, and they said, we want to create .hiv, and we want to bring together all organizations. We want to lower the stigma and so on. They worked beside their regular jobs, I think, for 5 years on this, and they managed to launch this top-level domain. We don't have to control them. We don't have to tell them what to do. Everything came out of them. Another experience, I met a bunch of guys in Berlin. They called themselves the part-time scientists, and their goal or vision was to become the first team, private organized team, to fly to the moon. Not by person, but to send a rocket to the moon, a launch module, and then 2 moon rovers. They are still working on this, but they want to become the first team next year when you have 50 years anniversary. You don't have to tell these people what to do. They find their culture, they find their values. Is this something you...
Oh yeah, I have a lot to say about this.
Yeah.
So what I love about that story is the passion of the team is coming through. Like, it's evident to me that team was absolutely passionate about that work and was committed to seeing that project launch. So I'll finish telling you a little bit more about that research study, and then I have another one that we did last fall where we were really trying to understand more about what generates creative energy for people at work. So this kind of thing that you're talking about, this like drive or this passion. With those superpowered teams, we learned a lot of other really incredible things. The thing that was true for all of them is that they could also articulate a very clear vision or mission for the way the world they wanted to be, or like the way they wanted the world to change, or and it didn't matter what they were doing day to day. And in some cases, the work might have been repetitive, or maybe not the most interesting from one moment to the next. But you could ask any of these people at any given moment, and they knew exactly where they were going, and they knew the world that they wanted to live in, what that looked like, whether that was a world free of cancer or a more joyous world. So they all had those visions deeply internalized within themselves. What we know from studying, inquiring more into the space of what energizes people, is people generate the most creative energy when they're working on things that have purpose, and I can kind of break that down for you, and in ways that create joy. And I have a lot to say about both of those. Purpose, and again, these are sort of ideas that maybe aren't new or different researchers have kind of bumped up against, and we're kind of just out in the field finding similar things, but kind of trying to make sense of it for ourselves and what the implications are for the kinds of decisions that we make as an organization or the products that we build. So purpose breaks down into really clear ways. I feel purpose in my work when I'm learning something new, or when I'm contributing in a meaningful way. And for the people that we study, this could be, I'm not doing something that anyone can do. I'm doing something that's uniquely mine to do, and I'm making an impactful contribution. And then the third is really impact. So I'm working on something that connects to a bigger mission or to the mission of my company, or I'm creating some kind of social impact. And so those three things.
Purpose, joy, impact.
Yeah,
That's simple.
Yeah, yeah. And then on the joy side, joy actually breaks down into really concrete things as well. So it might sound like very ethereal or fluffy.
No.
I actually love the KonMori method, the sort of does this bring me joy. Have you heard of this?
No.
It's a book that's sort of become really famous in the US. She's a Japanese author. I'm blanking on her name. It'll come to me in a minute.
Yeah, we'll find out.
But it's just this idea for like decluttering your life, and it's all about your house. But the idea is that you can bring that idea to, you know.
I've read it. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
It's amazing.
Marie
What's it?
Kondo.
Yeah.
Marie Kondo.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
She's so cool. And
Yeah.
she's so
And it's such
straight.
a,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, yeah. And it's such a simple idea. But when we started to talk about this creative energy with people, we actually saw really similar things in their work. So the things that brought them joy in their work were autonomy. So being able to decide when and how, and you were talking about this earlier, right? You just have an email address. You show up, you can sit down. I'm sure there's probably a lot of freedom in that about where people work and when people work.
Absolutely.
And so autonomy is a really big one.
Yeah.
Deciding how the work gets done is a part of autonomy as well. Inspiration. So being able to be inspired in your work. And for people, this could look like, and this is a little connected to autonomy, being able to walk outside and take a walk, or, you know, get some fresh inspiration by going to the museum for 30 minutes in the middle of the day. So inspiration, and autonomy. And then the third thing is support. So am I being supported in my role? Do I have supportive structures? And that can be the tools that I'm using or the technology. Is it too much? You know, because if it's too much structure, too much, it actually bogs people down and creates something we call drag. And all of these things together, when people are feeling creative energy, they're much more likely to experience flow in the near term. And we think that the longer term impact of working in ways that connect us to our creative energy is fulfillment. So that's kind of our working theory about those things.
It's I love that, and I'm already thinking, like, okay, flow, Mika, check Mihaly, how did he write it? And I try to bring it all together. But like one thing that is really bothering me, not bothering me, but I'm interested in, is when you connect that to the research that you did in your 20s about Europe and the big change there, and you compare that to today. What's the role of technology in that whole thing? Because there are a lot of people saying technology is just distracting, technology is bad, and I mean there are so many black and white perspectives, but there is something happening right now because it's there every day, and most likely with our kids it will be not even seen, but it will be everywhere. What's the role of technology in all that?
Well, maybe my view is a little radical in this way, in that like I really think humans belong at the center of these conversations. So I don't really want to have a conversation about technology and ignore people or what they value or what they're trying to do. At that same time, technology is shaping everything around us. It's shaping our behavior. It's shaping our networks. I do things today that I didn't do 10 years ago because of technology and what it creates in my life in both positive ways and ways that I wouldn't consider positive. So yeah, I don't have an answer to you, but I mean I think
having a conflict via WhatsApp, like or knowing, okay, he read the message but he's not answering. We had that the other day. Like Michael had something, Christoph, and he sent me a voice message, I think.
Yeah.
But then he was off for sports, or I don't know, and I'm like, oh man,
So stupid.
let's get on the phone.
And then
What is
he
doing?
said, well, Michael, topics like this we should discuss in person. I said, well, wise man, you're right.
So I'm,
I love you had a micro accord in that moment. You know?
because I'm one, like even the same like behavior. Like my kids see adults with smartphones all the time like this. I mean, that's so.
My kids really trained me to put it away. They said, Daddy, let's put it in the middle of the table.
Yeah.
And but let us put this one more step. When we talk to the other companies from the Bay Area, like Google. We met them last year. Philipp Schindler, Chief Commercial Officer, he said we just turned from a mobile first company to a AI first company. All these big companies are driven by artificial intelligence now, and they see the biggest changes in this area of technology. Is this a technology which is important for your services?
It is absolutely important, and I would reframe it for us in this way of saying we think about it as augmented intelligence, and we're committed to the human-centered nature of that intelligence, and so we have committed resources to doing research in those areas and really working to understand what is it that people want automated in their life. And I think that's a really core question. A fellow researcher of mine, actually 3 fellow researchers, Ruth Buchanan, Nebi Teklu, and Alex Freeman, were kind of digging in on this last year. And the coolest thing that they discovered, and they were researching in this space of, we know, for example, that coordination work is there's a lot of coordination costs to doing the work that we're doing, whether that's coordinating within our team or coordinating work across teams. And we've heard consistently that particularly for people who are, let's say, hybrid workers in this way, where they don't have a dedicated project manager or a dedicated coordinator to help them with their work. They're maybe doing creation or design, but then they're also having to do the coordination, that coordination work is a burden to them because they would rather be doing the other thing, whether that's selling, whether that's building relationships, whether that's designing something or creating something. It doesn't matter who we ask about this thing. Everyone wants to do more of the creative work in their life and more of the work that's uniquely theirs to do. And so if there's a place for a robot to work alongside them, like, we think that's great, but it's always in service of what that individual or what that person wants and the ways that they give that augmented intelligence permission to kind of operate in their life and work.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have in our podcast, I think we started yesterday, the last issue, a young lady, she founded LeapSum, which is a software as a service to create a lifelong learning organization. And it starts with one-on-one feedbacks, so you can ask for feedback from your colleague or you can give feedback. And there's an algorithm behind which helps then out of this feedbacks to allocate what are the areas where you need to learn. And I think this is the same attitude that you have. It's augmented intelligence. It helps to make people better, and it's not there to replace them.
And here we had a discussion that some of my people said, no, we want face-to-face because since we do all virtual, this is like the holy thing that we say, okay, and then you fly wherever you need to fly and you go wherever you need to go. But the feedback from LeapSum was then that they said, well, we actually found out it triggers more face-to-face conversation, or at least conversations, at least if you're triggered. So that's kind of this augmentation that you were also talking about. I like the idea. I'm quite curious to see. I also see AI and the impact it can have, like in terms of long-term, but the more short-term is more this assistant AI, augmented AI, helping with the process. I hope the human will still be the center of attention all the time. I really hope so.
Yeah. So we ask our guests always, what are the 5 books that influenced you the most? You already mentioned a couple of books, but maybe you have 1 or 2 more.
Yeah. So that book that I was reading, French author, I can never pronounce his name. It's embarrassing. I should I've been bringing it up recently, but it's a book called The Coming of the Book by Jean Lefebvre.
We will find out.
Thank you so much.
The Coming of the Book.
The Coming of the Book, yeah. And it's about this technological, the technology of the book. And when I say the technology of the book, like any technology, it's a confluence of hundreds of technologies, whether that's the technology of binding or of paper making, so that we didn't actually have to, slaughter animals and illuminate books on their backs. So that book was really incredible for me. I also, around the same time, I was reading a book called Art and Fear, which I love. I'd recommend it to anyone who's doing creative work. And it was written, there's co-authors, or two people who wrote it. And they're talking a lot about making art specifically, but I think that it has broad applications for taking risks or doing anything that's a little bit outside of the ordinary. Oh gosh.
They are new on our list.
Definitely. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
it's
No, it's
almost
fine.
the 50th
I think we
podcast.
have already 5.
I have
mentioned
so
it,
many
yeah.
more. I'll say from a practitioner perspective, we're kind of obsessed. The way that we research is really different and really special, and we're building on a lot of the ideas that started in Europe and were innovated in Scandinavia and are being practiced, I think, much more widely here, namely participatory design and co-design.
Oh yeah.
So our research process is co-creative, and to that end, there's a book called Convivial Toolbox, written by Elizabeth Sanders and Pieter Jan Stapper, I think. And we, as a team, love that book. It's a phenomenal book. And I'll have a few more for you if you...
awesome.
Yeah, they will emerge.
Put
Yeah,
them in the
that's
comments.
cool. That's cool.
So,
Yeah.
no, I love this, the idea of the coming of the book. I'm just thinking that you went so far back in your research, and again, what impact it has today, what happened there, because that's like the invention of the book was such a shift in what happened. If I got it right, it's bigger than what we experienced with the internet.
I think it was huge, and it's a technology that evolved over 1,000 years, effectively. And so the thing that we know of as the book today is a sort of compression of time. All of those ideas evolved, like books didn't have a table of contents for hundreds of years, and then somebody invented that, and that was a great idea, you know, to have pagination. And and papermaking, if you know about the technology, I believe started out in the East and slowly made its way over the course of hundreds of years to the West. And yeah, I'm totally fascinated by the technology of the book and all of the different decisions and people and actors. And it's all compressed now, and we don't think about a book as a piece of technology, but it really is. And for me, knowing that these kinds of histories, I think, help me take a longer view about tech. I think a lot of people are very myopic and sort of time constrained or you know, have a very limited window or limited perspective of these things. But we've been engaging with and building technology for as long as we've been a species.
One last question from my side. You lived in a tree for years. This sounds like a very mindful lifestyle. And how could you how could you take something out of this for your life now? I mean, you just told us you were in South Africa, the UK, so you travel a lot. You have a really busy job. So, but the way you express yourself is still like someone who lives a mindful life. How do you do this? Yoga, meditation. What is your recipe?
I write, like I do a lot of personal writing and reflection, not for public consumption, but for myself. It's always been a really central thing to my practice. And so I would say that, like just making time for reflection in my life and my work.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thanks so much for all the insights, for this very personal talk. I have to say, I forgot that we're still live. I was just reminded, like, we have to write a book. We have to write a book.
I hope I helped you on that
Oh,
journey.
absolutely.
Definitely.
absolutely. So
Definitely.
many new ideas popped
Thanks so
out.
much.
Cool.
Thank you so
And,
much.
yeah, thanks for being here on this experiment. And
Yeah, we would be very happy to get feedback
Of
from
course,
people
of
who
course.
watch this and
watching in that
this camera.
Also, thank you
Yeah.
guys for the experiment.
Thank you guys for the initiative.
for the autonomous initiative.
and for the foundation of the On the Way to New Work TV studio, which we just
Exactly.
launched today. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.